Okay, so good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us in the 6th event in the Summer Carnival program, which is halfway through the whole series, if you can believe it. It feels as if the vernissage was only a couple of weeks ago. I'm delighted to introduce and welcome 5 esteemed panelists to the stage. Professor Julia Gallagher, Professor in African Politics at the School of Oriental and African Studies, London, also a Senior Research Fellow at the Johannesburg Institute for Advanced Study, University of Johannesburg, and a Fellow of the Higher Education Academy. Professor Gallagher and I first met in Johannesburg almost a decade ago, so it's especially meaningful to welcome her and the other members of her team here today. Dr. Kukwa Manful is an assistant professor of architecture at Taubman College, University of Michigan, a visiting postdoctoral scholar at the Center for Advanced Study at Stanford University, and a postdoctoral scholar on the African State Architecture Project at SOAS. Welcome. Emmanuel Ofori-Sarpong is a PhD candidate at SOAS who completed his undergraduate and postgraduate degrees at the Kwame Nkrumah University of Science and Technology in Ghana. This is about, I think, the 3rd time we've shared a platform, so I'm especially pleased to be here with fellow Ghanaians Kukwa and Emmanuel. Fiona Nyadero is a Kenyan landscape architect working with the State Department of Housing and Urban Development, passionate about social justice in urban design and planning, and working to raise the profile of landscape architects, not only in Kenya, but in Africa. And last but not least, Olufemi Hinson-Yovo is an architect and artist from Benin, who studied in Paris. She opened her own research-based studio, SAH Studio in Cotonou, and I think this is your 3rd Biennale, maybe 4th? 3rd. So welcome all of you. I'm delighted that you're here. As I've said a couple of times in the introductions in this Carnival program, it was always my ambition to host talks and events with very different kinds of participants and guests, from emerging architect filmmakers to activists, politicians, mayors, and urbanists. Today's panel of scholars look at the ways in which buildings shape politics, articulating power relations in the ways they are designed, built, and used. Africa's state buildings, parliaments, ministries, and presidential palaces reflect both the complexities and ambiguities of the politics of the continent's many states. To put one of those complexities in context, I'd like to share a short memory from my time spent working as an architect in Namibia some 30 years ago. The office where I worked was in charge of renovating the Parliament building, and one of my jobs was to take carpet measurements. I was a very junior architect at the time. I saw that the distance between the government benches and the opposition was 3.916 meters, not 4 meters. And I casually asked someone, another architect, I think, why it wasn't a simple 4 meters. And he told me that the plan actually derives from the distance in fencing between 2 swords, or rapiers as they're known in fencing. When you take up the en garde position in fencing at the start of a duel, you put out your sword and it touches your opponent's sword, and that distance is 3.916 meters. The Houses of Parliament are 6,000 miles away from Windhoek, and as far as I know, there is no history or tradition of fencing in Namibia. Yet a spatial distance that comes literally from the other side of the world is maintained as if it were a universal fact. It might seem a silly and inconsequential thing to know, but the fact has stayed with me for over 30 years. Lots of many other architectural details have fallen by the wayside, but not this one. African politics, like politics all over the world, is in a state of flux. And now, more than ever, the careful, thoughtful, and self-reflective scholarship of the kind that the African State Architecture Project provides is essential to understanding not just where we have come from, but perhaps more importantly, where we may go. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Leslie, and thank you so much for inviting us. We're thrilled to be here. My colleagues will come up in a little while and you'll meet them all. But I'm going to start just by introducing the project and today what we're going to be looking at. So my name is Julia Gallagher, and I head a team researching the politics of architecture in Africa at SOAS, University of London. And this team includes colleagues academics working on and from the continent, from Ethiopia, Ghana, Zimbabwe, and 2 of us from the UK. And in particular, we are interested in how citizens read the state in its buildings. We asked lots of questions. What do citizens make of the structures that house and symbolize the state, including schools or parliaments, airports, courts, football stadiums, or regional organizations? Do citizens value these buildings? Do they see themselves reflected in them? Do citizens feel excluded or alienated by them? In fact, what do the perspectives of citizens tell us about how institutions and identities are formed in the difficult processes of state and nation-making since colonialism? And all of this is to help us understand how can and how do relatively young countries begin to build themselves in between the messiness of colonial legacies, tight economic constraints, and circumstances many times where citizens find it difficult to trust their political institutions. So this event today offers 2 perspectives on these themes, and both of them explore, they're particularly interested in the relationships between political elites and citizens through the medium of architecture. So the first perspective from the research itself is our film, which we're going to show you in a minute, called Building Africa. And the film tells 5 stories about how architecture shapes the continent. And these stories are seen through the eyes of citizens from South Africa, Zimbabwe, Ghana, the Democratic Republic of Congo, and Ethiopia. And you might recognize some of the contributors in the film. And the 5 stories show that relationships between political elites and citizens are more ambivalent, and the colonial legacies are more surprising than we might expect. The second perspective is from our newly published book, Building African Futures. And this is written by 10 young African architects, urban designers, and activists. And the book takes the discussion into more practical areas, thinking about how built environments work, how they don't work, and how they can be made to work better in 8 African cities. So the book's editors are here, and 2 of its authors, and we will be coming up after the film to discuss the book's themes and the broader questions about how to use architecture to build better African cities. But that comes later. First, the film.
I think we'll just cut the credits short so we can move on. Thank you to everybody. And welcome to the second part of the session, as Julia mentioned. My name is Kukwa Manfo. I'm Assistant Professor of Architecture at the Tubman College of Architecture and Urban Planning at the University of Michigan. And joined on this panel with me today are my lovely colleagues, collaborators. Fiona Nyadero is a Kenyan landscape architect working with the State Department of Housing and Urban Development. Through the Kenya Urban Support Program, she's made significant inputs to various infrastructure developments within the county government of Taita Taveta. Through her work, writing, and advocacy, Fiona hopes to contribute to raising the profile of landscape architecture in Kenya. She's passionate about social justice in urban design and planning and climate-responsive design. Fiona is one of the authors in the book we are launching, which is an edited collection of 10 essays, which you can see behind, the title behind. Olufemi Hinsinyovo is a polymath creative, trained both as an architect and artist. After studying a Bachelor of Architecture and an MA in Fine Arts in the UK, she received a Master's in Architecture and at Dessa in École Spéciale Paris. In Abidjan, under a renowned firm, she oversaw Benin's leading construction project, 20,000 houses. In 2021, she opened a polymath research-based practice in Cotonou, SAH Studio, developing projects from various scales and materiality, celebrating local context with a focus on decolonizing architecture. She has participated in several biennales, as Leslie mentioned, exhibited at African Mobility's Munich, and is a laureate of the Prince Claus Building Beyond 2023 prize. She's also a tutor at the African Design School in Cotonou, exploring urban public spaces. Professor Julia Gallagher is a professor of African politics at SOAS University of London. Her research focuses on state building and state-society relations in Africa. She's written about Western ideas and images of Africa, China and Africa, and on Zimbabwe's politics and international relations. She's currently working on a project on the politics of state buildings and architecture in Africa, and has published other work on aesthetics and the state in Ghana, Ethiopia, and South Africa. Emmanuel Ofori-Sarpong is an architect and academic from Ghana, where he completed both his bachelor's and master's at the Kwame Nkrumah University of Science and Technology in Kumasi. He has worked in both mainstream and activist architecture practices and has taught at the School of Architecture and Design at the Central University in Accra. He's currently a PhD candidate in politics and international studies at SOAS University of London, where his research explores the politics of post-independence new city projects in East and West Africa, specifically focusing on Ghana and Kenya. So in a minute, or more than a minute, after this first round of questions I'm going to ask the panelists, I will invite you to ask your questions. So just start thinking of any questions you might have, and when I invite you, you raise your hand and the mic will be brought to you, I think. So I'll start with Emmanuel. The editors of the book are all academics, but this is certainly not a typical sort of academic book. So as one of the editors, can you tell us about this process of putting this book together? How did it come about? Why these kinds of essays? Why these authors?
Okay, thank you. So the book, as you well know, started when we had a series of conversations about what young professionals in Africa are thinking about the urban challenges that the continent faces, but also in terms of what a future or a potential future might look like. I think it came from a place of always coming across ideas from the West or from other parts of the world and having almost or very little from the continent itself. So for example, I remember, as you mentioned, being in architecture school in Ghana, looking at all the recommended readings, and a lot of it were just Western names. And you always sort of wonder, are there any ideas, which, of course, not to say those should be thrown out, that any ideas that come from this place or written by people who work in these institutions that can complement these ideas from other parts of the world. So I think we were really looking for people on the ground, what they were experiencing, what they were thinking, and what they were imagining as a way to bring other voices into the conversation. Yeah, so it wasn't really about academics, even though there's space, there's work to be done there. It was really about the people at the forefront of the challenges that the continent faces. Yeah.
Thank you. Julia, we've just watched this lovely film, Plug-in. It was put together by Sunil Pun. And we watched this film about building Africa, and this book titled Building African Futures. So apart from the obvious love of puns about building Africa, they both have this strong ground level, bottom-up idea of very granular themes. So can you tell us more about that larger academic project and how this book fits in? Yeah.
Yes, thank you. So I think one of the things that came very clearly from the research, there were 5 of us working on this project, and you've seen Kukwa as part of it, and there were 3 others who aren't here today, but all of us were really looking at, not looking at the often told stories about how elites conceive buildings or how architects build them or how competitions work, but actually how they're received and understood, and they're actually co-created through the way citizens use them and think about them. And all of the stories that we gathered are really complicated and often quite messy. You know, people have very ambivalent feelings about the building and the institutions that they house, as you see, and sometimes they're positive, sometimes they're negative, and often they're a mixture of the two, and it's complicated. And I think one of the things that we were very keen to do was to get away from this story that you often see about architecture and architects, which is sort of very abstracted and becomes something quite pure and almost sort of separated from ordinary life. I mean, I came to architecture as an outsider. I'm not an architect. But I was quite sort of surprised to see how often architects write about their work as though somehow it's almost sort of either has nothing to do with the people who are using it or is going to organize the people who use it to be better people. And the idea of therefore this book was to engage with this new generation of African architects, urban planners, and activists who didn't see it like that, who see the complexity and want to engage with it fully. And that was what the workshop was about, and that's what the book is about. And it's really about, this is not a generation, or certainly our authors are not representing a generation which is trying to tidy things up, but actually trying to engage with life, with politics as it actually is. And I think that's where the book really fits.
Excellent, thank you. And Fiona, so your chapter opens with what I think is a really fascinating account about how you overheard a conversation between people who didn't know who you were, about a project that you were excited about and thought solved all your problems, but they didn't really like it. And it really speaks to the spirit of the collection that Julia and Manuel have both mentioned. So can you speak more about your experiences and the ideas behind this essay you wrote for the book?
Thank you, Kukwa. I think right from training, we're trained to handle, sorry about my voice, we're trained to handle like individual clients or work in firms and all that. No one really prepares you for a career in public service per se as an architect or as a landscape architect. So when you get to the public sector, like I did, it's a bit more of a shift where you're dealing with that person who basically gives you the brief, but he probably won't use that particular product. So the public are the ones who are going to use your product. So instead of actually listening to this person, then you should be listening for the brief from the public. But that doesn't happen because it's the public. There are many. The logistics of just trying to get them together and have them speak with, collect the ideas together is a bit tasking. So when, essentially it was my first project, it was a market project. We thought we did everything right, we handled everyone needs and all that. But I'm walking around, the market is ongoing construction, and what happened was there was a kiosk inside the market which wasn't taken down because people were still using it. So there wasn't any hoarding around the construction site. So people can actually see what is happening inside. So I'm walking there on my way home one day, and some of the traders are like, these things you're building, they're for you. They're not for us. We're not going to use them because, it's a waste of resources. You should have just done this, and this. Essentially, this information eventually reached my bosses, and they decided to change it. But that's what prompted me into thinking, these people were taken through the public participation process for this particular market, and they said yes, they agreed, we have the documentation. And here they are at this stage of the construction, still wishing things would be different. So what if we had this visualization brought to them before we start constructing these things? They can better understand the project. Yeah.
Thank you for that. And Femi, I have a similar question for you. Your essay really is on point with the manifestos in the title because it opens so powerfully as a manifesto. And it addresses housing, which is a big issue in African countries, but also resonates globally. So can you speak more about the experiences and ideas that inspired your essay?
Thank you for the question. I just want to do a little aparté because we met here in Ghana a year ago and we did the symposium, and now we're doing this in Venice, so I just wanted to thank you for that and also Prof. Leslie for that. Now, on to my answer. Basically, what happened is that I ended up working on a 20,000 housing project in Benin, and it was quite an amazing project in that sense that it was the first of that scale back home to address housing. But then at the same time, I literally faced the same concern that Fiona just mentioned, that we started the project all excited, and I'm going to give you a little anecdote. The brief of the project was on 1 page of A4 for an entire 20,000 housing project. So that's what Fiona is mentioning, the lack of the right information from the people, the input to put inside the building and have it adapted to local needs. So for me, working there for 3.5 years, it was really interesting in the beginning because we did the urbanism, I don't know if you're familiar with ZEM, which has the little okadas in Benin. So we work on lanes for those things. So that was interesting. But then the architecture itself and some other things were lacking local identity, local color, and local kind of ways of life, accommodating the climate, etc. So after working on that project for almost 4 years, I felt a bit like, dazed and underwhelmed because I realized that at that scale, if you have such money and you are still not able to go fully 100, then there is a problem. So that's when I saw the opportunity of the call, I had to address the thinking about beforehand of the project, thinking about how to do better project, which is also in line with just what Fiona mentioned.
Thank you very much. At this point, if anyone has questions, please just raise your hands. I'll keep going with my questions, and I'll be looking out. Yeah. So back to Emmanuel. So as editors, you opened the introduction to the book with this story about what is known as the wager between Ghana and Côte d'Ivoire. Why did you do this? How does this connect to this issue of bottom-up solutions?
So to begin with, I think I always found the wager interesting, and for those who may not know, this is a story of how almost a month after independence, Ghana's first president goes to Ivory Coast or the Côte d'Ivoire for a break because basically he's very tired. He's been fighting for independence, and Houphouët-Boigny hosts him for a dinner. And at that event, he basically, so there are two ideas. Nkrumah thinks, okay, you have to get away from the West. You don't have to have any ties. Let's rethink this thing called Africa. Let's have a Pan-African vision. Houphouët seems to think, I still want to have a relationship with France. I still want to keep this sort of Francophone connection. And so the question is whose path is going to end up developing their countries better, and that becomes known as the West African wager, which ends up, a lot of scholars in political economy subsequently studied this a lot because then it gives them a basis to compare Ghana and the Ivory Coast in terms of who had done well. A lot of people believe Ghana lost in the end, but I think that story was interesting for me for a number of reasons, but the most important one is this idea of that sort of, I think there's a sort of a competition there, but it's for ideas, right? And it's like a competition of ideas between two giants in West Africa, if I should say. And I thought that there was some resonance with what we're doing now with this book of sort of bringing ideas from different parts of the continent, and a lot of times they may not necessarily even sort of resonate or work together. There'll be disagreements. But for me, there's a certain lack of a continued conversation across borders, and we've been talking about this quite a bit. For what it's worth, a lot of that is because of our own colonial history and internal suspicions. And so that story of, okay, beyond all of these presidents and political figures having a debate amongst themselves about the way forward, could this contribute to a sort of a conversation about the way forward, but not amongst politicians or the elite, but between citizens and ordinary people. And so that is how it sort of connects to the book, yeah.
Thanks for that. And to Julia as well, as we've heard, you're a professor of African politics, and you've done a lot of work, especially on how people experience the state or read the state through architecture. What kind of themes do you see connecting through the book and, again, through your previous research looking at these issues?
Thank you. So I think one of the things that's very interesting is the themes that arise in the different countries that we cover in the book. So there are big themes, and obviously rapid urbanization is a massive theme internationally, but very much so in Africa. And so all our authors are tackling issues in large cities and thinking about the huge pressures that they face with certainly sort of spatial legacies from colonialism, so inequalities that are built into the spaces, in terms of the quality and extent of the infrastructure, which is often finding it very difficult to keep up with the large numbers of people arriving in these cities as they grow. At the same time, often dealing with colonial legal structures which are inadequate and often reinforce problems, and several of the authors deal with these colonial legal legacies which have created this mess of legislation to do with how land is allowed to be owned and how it can be sold and redistributed, and it causes enormous problems. And then alongside this, problems that I think you find in every city of a kind of tension between authorities that want to tidy things up and people that want to live creative lives, and this sort of thinking about how this can work and whether, you know, informality, for example, can be allowed. You know, whether that's something which, you know, has to be sort of swept off the streets, and whether you have to sort of create everything in a formal way, or whether actually you say, what is wrong with informality, and can we make it work better, and can we involve citizens in this? So there's lots of themes across them which are similar. But one of the things that I think is really important is also how the different political contexts and cultural contexts mean that authorities and citizens are often meeting these challenges in different ways. So yes, often similar kinds of challenges. Housing is a big one, of course, the pressure on lack of housing, which Femi's project was designed to sort of try and sort out very rapidly, but actually also that it doesn't play out in the same way everywhere. It's different everywhere across the continent. Africa is, it's a cliche to say it, is a place of huge difference.
Thank you for that. So Fiona first, and this is a follow-up on something you mentioned in your earlier answer. You said people agree to you did a public consultation by the book and the way we're supposed to do in big planning projects, and people agreed to it initially before you overheard this chance overhearing of this conversation. Can you reflect on why you think they accepted the project? Like, what did they think they were getting? Can you reflect on this? Just finish it.
All right. So in terms of what happens in public participation forums, I don't think that there are actually two challenges in that. One, people don't have access to the information that they're going to be presented with. First of all, beforehand, they don't have it. And even if they get there, it's vague. It's almost like a brief they're being given. But these are actual people. I don't want to say lay people, but yeah, that, for lack of a better word, you can't really expect a person to understand those specifications and all that right from the word go. So you need to break it down. You need to have it in a way that they can understand. The way this person reacted and said that, you know, those structures that are coming up, we're not going to use them, it's because she saw them. Yeah? So she could imagine they're already there. Now, the other issue that you have is what do we do? Okay. By we, I'm placing myself as the people who come in with the information. What do we do with the information that we get from the public? Because most times people go in with a fixed mindset. This is my design, the architect's ego. You know, this is my baby. I want to protect it. I don't want any other views. And when it's a public project, it's even worse, because you have a mixed pot of ideas you're going to get at the end of it all. So we need to find a more efficient way to actually handle public participation of infrastructure projects, of architecture projects throughout the country, because it's a problem that's happening all over Kenya.
Yeah. Thank you. Question? Yeah. You first.
Thank you. Hi, my name is Philip, and I'm from Namibia. And I was very interested to see the examples first that were in the film, particularly the South African court and the Zimbabwean parliament, because in Namibia we have very similar situation as in Zimbabwe, where all our sort of post-independence monuments, a sort of national museum, the State House, and the Heroes Acre were all built by this North Korean company that builds all over Africa these very similar type of buildings. So a very similar narrative then as the Zimbabwean example versus the South African example. And for me, what I find very difficult in these conversations always is that for some reason, and I think it's been mentioned already, that in Africa there's always this urge that we must now suddenly create this identity that then speaks for, a country, a continent, and so on. And even within a country, I mean, Namibia is a very small population, very small place, and yet it is diverse, and it's very difficult at this point in time to speak of a solid, united identity that can be miraculously portrayed in architecture, right? Whereas in my mind, the South African example is, and the little that I know about the project, is not so much about the identity that it ultimately portrays, which is very diverse because it has like a sort of broad array of authors, if you can call it that, beyond the architects, right? Is the process that actually led to that building. It was a year-long process of involving the various former inmates and a lot of people, and of course it's very different from building a building from scratch out in the prairie somewhere. So all of this is to say, or I'd be interested in the book if you, and you've been talking to this process of public participation, if you also examine how new or young architects, new practices are actually operating in Africa, right? Because for me it's really in that. I think the question about identity and so on is a perpetual search. In many other countries, we would hardly ask if the German parliament designed by Norman Foster, does it really represent Germany? It's like nobody cares. It's a building, right? And it does what it needs to do. So why this urge, that we need to speak to our identity rather than speaking to a process that yields something that is, meaningful because the process made it meaningful, irrespective of how it looks. So I'd be interested if there are stories or sort of reflections in the book that any of you could perhaps share with us. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think it's a fascinating set of questions, and I would say that those who have identity don't have to worry about about explaining it. But the equation, insofar as I can remember, has always been that somehow Africa, as a concept, does not have enough to give to architecture, that Africa is always lacking in some way. After 30 years, I have come to the conclusion it is the complete opposite, which I think picks up on your point, which it is that architecture is what's lacking, not Africa. That there is something about the complexity of coming out of a history of silencing, coming out of a history of lack of self-confidence, lack of self-worth, that exacerbates the need to express something, which is where I would say that the the kind of singular hunger for something that expresses oneself in the absence of the permission, if you like, to express it, or in the absence of that history, let's say, coming to its fruition. But also that we take it as read that architecture as a thing, as a discipline, can't be moved. And it's very interesting for me that the main criticisms of this Biennale certainly have been, almost without exception, where's the architecture? Which is to say that actually people are not looking in the right places for it. They're looking with a particular lens and can't see it. So the question of being able to see differently, to understand differently, to make, build, express differently, that's the real question. And in a way, in all of these conversations around architecture and Africa, whatever that equation is, it comes back to one thing, which is education. And that's really where the battle is. So it's not a question at all. Yeah.
I know you said it's not a question, but I do see a kind of question in there because, so I'll ask everyone to comment on this. But so I think the main question is like, why does it, Philip's question is, why does it even matter? Like, why does a building have to have a certain identity? Why do people need to feel connected to their building in that way? I hope I've captured it somehow. Okay. And with Leslie's, I think it speaks to one of the essays in the collection, Julia, Chan's education one, for instance. So maybe I start with Femi, and then we go to Fiona, and then you and Emmanuel can speak about the decolonization. So Femi, why does identity, why do these houses have to have any local context or connection?
Okay, I think as Leslie just said, yeah, you may think that if you have identity that you don't have to claim it, but I think we have to reclaim it because it has been tried to be erased. So in that sense, we have to find our way through it. Because for example, I don't look at architecture just as the building format or the building material, because if it reflects the climate and the people, it will be great architecture. And identity, climate is embedded with that. I'm wearing Beninese cotton because it's light, and that's what works better in my environment. It has the elements of identity, but it also has the element of functionality. If it's about just material and form, and the identity is just that sort of what we call facadism in architecture, then it's devoid of interest. But if it's about functionality, practicality, just like we love to live outside buildings, but we build concrete shells with the tiniest window and we are hot, and then we have ACs and we have huge electrical bills. It doesn't work. If we build better house, better home that accommodate for our climate, and then has also some cultural language that also make us embrace more our cultural heritage, then I want to have identity to also, because as Africans, we have been made less proud of ourselves. So if I'm seeing, for example, a Beninese kingdom motif in my building, and it helps the youngins looking at, oh, this is like our throne from Benin, looking on the window, then it can take me to look at a book, oh, I'm learning from my own kingdom, etc., etc., etc. That's how we work. So yes, it should be about identity, but it should not be about identity just for the sake of sprinkling something. It should be about identity because it's at the core of the people. And if you look at something else, it's just the fact that the way we design right now is very not oriented for ourselves. So if we have to rethink about our own self to redesign better, then we should. That's why I ended up having like a research-based practice, because we don't know much about ourselves. I had to do research because of that project, because it was so much devoid of some important things that you naturally have to go to the area where you find the information and not build about the past, but building for the future.
Thank you for that. Yeah, Fiona.
For me, I'll start with, we all have that one song or poem that you keep going back to. And mostly the reason we keep going back to is because you relate to it, right? And it's the same for these buildings or infrastructure. I'll mostly talk about infrastructure because that's my area of expertise. We all have that infrastructure that you keep going back to because you can relate to it. And that's what I think it's important. Because once, if you don't relate to it, then you'll feel it like that's not for me, that's for another person. And what that ends up being is you have this massive piece of infrastructure that you spent resources on that could have been used elsewhere, and it's completely unused. That's one of my pain points in this essay, is emerging towns have very limited resources, then they have to do a lot of things. So if you're going to prioritize something, then let it be something that is going to be used by everyone and not just sitting there abandoned. Yeah.
Yes, thank you. And I think this leads kind of really well, Julia, into this one essay that tackled the issue of architectural education.
Yeah, absolutely. So a lot of the essays do think about decolonization and how you tackle these legacies. And I think one of the themes that comes out of them is not about just saying it's a colonial inheritance, therefore we get rid of it. It's about saying, why would we keep it? I mean, what's the point of it? If there's a point, then maybe we keep it, but we decide. So that's really, I think, one of the conclusions about what decolonization means that comes from the book. But this final essay, which is written by Chan Simon, who's the author at the bottom, who's from South Sudan, which is one of which is the newest country in the continent, with a massive education deficit after years of war. The essay is about decolonizing education using architectural methods, which is a fascinating idea, and it's about using the methods of teaching architecture, which is to do with the critique and the various ways of building and making, and using a variety of different methods, so thinking, but also making, experiencing material, as well as having sort of intellectual approaches to how you make things. And his argument is that this is a really good way of thinking about what decolonization means. All these things about thinking about your environment, about where you fit into it, how you make it work, how you also work within it, how you realize your own limitations in it. And he makes this really beautiful argument about this is a really good way of thinking about how you decolonize architecture. And he comes up with this fantastic way of, in fact, teaching, and he's talking about 3- to 5-year-olds and 7-year-olds, little tiny children, about how getting them out into the outside world of playing with sand, of making things, of deciding on what is important, of bringing things from home, of talking to your family about what's important and the ideas that have shaped them. All this, he says, is an architectural approach to education. It's a really fabulous ending to the book.
Thank you for that. I was also going to ask you as an editor, but I changed my mind just hearing Julia talk about that. Because you have taught architectural, yes. Like even an architectural educator, but you're also a researcher. And I was thinking, especially as Julia was speaking, of your case study on housing, and it really connects to Philip's question about identity and where's the line, as Femi just mentioned, is there really a line? Because it's if you think of the function, if you think how people fit in, if you think how people relate in, doesn't identity naturally evolve for making something that people feel completely comfortable and happy in?
I think I absolutely agree with Femi's point. I think what I'll add to that is, what I get from the question is almost and I get this a bit from students sometimes, which seems to me like sometimes a dichotomy between what you think about as function, because you say the German parliament, it works. Nobody's asking, does this depict, My take is, I don't think human beings work like that, right? And I think back to something like Viktor Frankl's idea, or I hope I'm right, man's search for meaning, right? The stories we tell ourselves matter, right? And when you come from a place like everybody has said, where the stories have been stories which divide, stories which diminish, then sometimes there's a need to retell those stories, reconfigure them. So for me, it's not an either or, it's a both and. Of course, we want buildings that work. We want buildings that, you know, function to keep us warm. We want buildings that, you know, make it easy to find your way. We want all that, but also we want buildings that tell us stories. And sometimes it's easy to think that myths are needless, but really those myths are an essential part of what it means to do architecture and what it means to transform the way a society thinks about itself. And so based on my own experience in education back in Ghana, I can tell that, of course, education, architectural education now has, it did not drop out of the sky, you know, it has its own history of how, let's say, the colonial government and later post-independence states shaped it to very specific ends. And my critique of it has always been that the component of thinking at a very sort of conceptual, ideological level, if I should use ideological in quotes, tends to be missing. And so it's a lot about, okay, how do these things function? How do they work together? And like I said, I just don't think human beings are wired to just think about how things work. We value stories. And so for me, it's been a bit of a struggle to reintroduce that. Time frames don't always work for that. There's a lot of missing, and again, it goes back to having this book because there's a lot of missing literature that needs to be written. There's a lot of missing histories that need to be written. There's a lot of stories that need to be told and retold, reinvented even. And so it's a bit of a struggle to do all that work in the context of sometimes very little resources, right? Yeah.
Thank you for that. Okay, so another 2 questions there. Let's just take.
Hello everyone. My name is Jean-Guillaume. I'm from Togo. First off, I feel really humble and privileged to be part of this setting where we're talking about Africa on such a big platform for architecture and art. I think I want to jump on something Emmanuel said at the beginning about having just very few voices that exist today and to share or that have like a concrete experience or knowledge about how people are living on the ground in these countries in Africa. And I wonder if you can share with us any hurdle that you face in the practice of your research, but also how do you make sure that, okay, beyond this platform here, when we're on the ground in Africa, that people are really listening to the alternative that you're offering. Yeah, if you can tap a little bit into that, and think any one of you, that would be really interesting. Thank you.
Hi. So I'm Mounit from Côte d'Ivoire and Ethiopia. And I have 2 questions. The first one is, well, we say that the future is African and also that the future is female. So how is it being an African woman architect doing research on the continent, and how does it infuse your research, your process? And the second one is, how do we, as African architects who studied outside of the continent, maybe in Europe, and worked there, how do we get back to our home countries or other African countries and, I mean, decolonize ourselves and get into a more African perspective?
Thank you. Emmanuel missed the first part of the first question. Could you just, like, one line? Oh, no. Wait, just 2 at a time. Oh, sorry. Emmanuel missed the first part of the first question, so can we take that, and then we'll answer the 2 questions, and then we'll come. Yeah. Oh, we need a translator. Yes, yours, the first part. Yeah, if you just, yeah, he missed that part.
So to me, is how do we make sure the work you're doing, the research that you guys are working on, how do we make sure that this is shared further beyond this scene here, which obviously is very much looking into the future of architecture?
So we'll answer the 2, and then by then we'll have the...
Okay, so I think this is why I'm really happy to be able to work with Prof. Gallagher, because we have generous funding, and we are able to make these books, and they are available for free online for those who want to, get them. And again, for a very long time, even access to books, for anybody who are schooled in any part of Africa, right? Access to the knowledge. Sometimes you don't even know what the conversation is about. And for me, that the internet was like a big shift for me personally and for a lot of our mates, right, who were in school around the same time. Because sometimes you are not in the room, not because you don't have the capacity to be there, because you really you're not even aware that this is what the conversation is about. So how do you contribute to a conversation you're not aware of? So I think as a first step, the fact that all the work we are doing now, thankfully, is open access, and I can share it with my former students, or to some degree, some of whom I still mentor now, and say that, read this book, and you can just click and download it. It's a huge step. I think the other way would be to bring more people in, because, again, architecture has tended to be, and it makes me think back to, I think the book is called The Favored Circle, right? It's tended to be a playground of a small group of people who are seen as the best, and everybody has to follow the small group. But then again, that results in a situation where, like you say, you go back to your context, and what you're trying to achieve, right, you find you're on a very different, you've been having different conversations from everybody else. Nobody can relate to what you're saying, right? And so to bring more people into the room, to hear more voices is how you sort of again, this is really at the heart of the idea of dissemination, right? To break that mode of thinking that, it has to be a few people, to think that we can include more people. So at the top of my head, these are the two ways I think we can get to sort of diffusing the ideas. Yeah.
And this is an excellent point for some plugs. So we're going to have 2 other launch events of this book, one in Accra in November and one in London. And the core part of this book, which, by the way, is designed by Ghanaian book graphic designer David Anete-Abe, is posters. So these chapters they're also short because they are also designed to be kind of accessible. So we want people who do not have technical knowledge to be able to pick it up and understand and read it. But also people who can't really read English to also understand. So each chapter has an accompanying poster designed by this graphic designer, which breaks it down into a format that can be distributed on WhatsApp or printed out. So we're speaking to each of the authors, and they're thinking of ways to put these things up in the places that the problems are. So like Fiona's would be in her market, Femi can be somewhere related to the housing project, just to make it more accessible, because as she said, this is like absolutely a big issue that and this kind of connects to your question as well, like we're doing all this work for various reasons. We can't do it in our home countries, and we do it then. We do have to find ways to send it back. So on the second question, because it was like, how is it like being an African woman architect? I think it's very obviously first Femi answers, and then Fiona can also speak.
Thank you for a very, important question right now. So I'd say that I realized I was a woman architect, like when I started working. I think before that, it never occurred to me that I was a woman in architecture. And then all of a sudden, I was in, project managing this huge project, and then I realized, okay, I am a woman, etc. So it was quite interesting in a way that you'll go on building construction meetings, and people will think you are the secretary when you're actually, in fact, the project manager of the project. So it's quite interesting, and I think one of the things is that instead of focusing sometime on the work, you're focusing on making male ego comfortable or things like that. And I am here being the project manager, and then I have to accommodate small things here and there. Not because I don't value my own self, but because I want to have a better working relationship with people. And then I realized that that wasn't always the way. But you have to be able to shape-shift and navigate it. Sometimes you have to find that masculine power, and sometimes you have to find the feminine power. So even for your own self, it's quite a challenge on a daily basis to kind of navigate that. But I think that the more we are seeing female architects all around the space, I think it's making the field more accessible. but it's still very difficult, and I had to change the way I dress, for example. Wonder if I should wear lipstick or not, because I don't want people to be, focusing on the color of my nails or so you have to say, okay, should I have long nails, short nails? So it's just a waste of time thinking about, okay, I'm a woman, how do I go on with this thing? And then just a simple example, sometimes I used to wear short sleeve like this, but now I realize I cannot anymore. I just want to wear long sleeve just to make sure I am comfortable and shielded in a room full of men. It's simple things like that I shouldn't be doing, but I am doing up to this day to just feel like, okay, I'm a woman, but that's not the problem right now. The problem is architecture. Let's focus on that. So yeah, that's what I can comment about that. And then the second question about finding your way back to the continent, I think I was lucky enough to very early on say I want to move back, and I found the way to do that. But it wasn't easy because you have to decolonize yourself and your own curriculum, because you learned from European way of thinking, material, etc. So you have to find example of your same climate elsewhere. So I had to look at maybe Vietnam, India, Mexico for inspiration. And also, for example, I used to be in awe with Japanese final detail. And then I went to Japan and I realized we don't have the money of Japan, so it cannot work. So I have to wire my brain. Another example is how we have our cities more painted in white and white and white. White is a modern construction. If you look in the 60s, architecture is yellow and orangish. So you have to say, okay, white doesn't work anymore. I have to shift my thinking to come to what locally people can do, but also have an upgrade. So it's that shifting again. Thank you.
Okay, on the question of being a woman in the built environment, I think for me, I survive by being I'm always very opinionated, and that has been just me from the word go. So that's how I survive, being very opinionated. And I'm also humbled, in this forum where we are, I always find myself being the youngest in the room. So that's another challenge on its own. Yeah, just be opinionated. Focus on what you want to say. You have the content. You believe in yourself. Yeah, go do what you do. On the issue of coming back to the continent, I can't really speak much to that. I spent most of my life in Kenya, educated in Kenya. But you're welcome to South Africa. Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, can we take that question?
Mi scuso, la faccio in italiano perché non sono in inglese. Ecco. Io non sono un professionista, nel senso che non ho mai lavorato sull'architettura, ho lavorato sempre con slow food sul cibo. Però mi incuriosisce una cosa. La prima domanda è, conoscete l'esperienza del Sud Sudan dove Enzo Piano ha fatto quella clinica con emergency? E se la ritenete un po' che riesca a leggere lo spirito africano? E poi l'altra questione è che, appunto, mi scuso se la mia informazione è completa, però ho visto in Africa, su riviste, parecchie scuole fatte con la terra cruda. Una tecnica che tiene conto del problema ambientale. E sono fatte anche in maniera geniale. E mi sembra che siano architetti africani. So che c'è un movimento riguardo all'uso dei materiali semplici, no? La terra. Ecco. Il secondo aspetto sull'architettura, probabilmente, e questo penso ragiono un po' permettetemi, da bianco, nel senso che l'architettura dovrebbe dimenticare l'architettura, cioè cambiare paradigma. Le città, se noi non entriamo nella logica di coltivare la città, coltivare non è organizzare, è qualcosa di più. Andiamo avanti. Coltivare l'acqua per una città cosa vuol dire? Capite che adesso noi stiamo buttando via dall'acqua, la città. Abbiamo problemi ambientali, questo io lavoro a Padova, stiamo ragionando con gli ambientalisti su questo tema. Noi dobbiamo usare l'acqua della pioggia. Questa è la cosa più semplice. Coltivare il calore. Capite che è completamente diversa la logica se noi usiamo questo parametro? Il calore sostanzialmente, cosa stiamo facendo soprattutto nelle città? Sta diventando un rifiuto, semplicemente i condizionatori cosa fanno? Buttano il calore in strada che diventa un rifiuto. Finisco, il concetto di coltivare. Credo che l'Africa, l'architettura africana ha più libertà rispetto a noi bianchi, permettetemi questo. Soprattutto sull'uso dei materiali. Io ho visto delle scuole bellissime, adesso permettetemi, non finisco perché, ecco, aspetto con curiosità le vostre risposte.
Just to recap, because not all of you had the translation. So the first question was, and please correct me if I missed something, was about the hospital, emergency hospital Renzo Piano designed in South Sudan, and whether that's a good example of African architecture. I don't know if you're familiar with it, I'm not, so you will answer. Oh, okay. Then second question is about also the suitability of earth bricks for building on the continent, if you can speak to that. And then this idea of growing the city, farming it rather than designing it. So collecting, harnessing energy and water instead of exploiting it. There's a lot of wastage in cities. So to speak to this kind of harnessing and growing the city instead of exploiting it. And the last one is, I'm not sure the question, but like African architecture seems freer than other ones, and if you could speak to that. So maybe we start from Emmanuel and then walk down.
So I'm not as familiar with the Renzo Piano project, but I've definitely seen a few emergency projects. For me, of course, no, I don't think anybody has ever said, and neither will I say, that the fact that we are working in Africa means that it only has to be Africans. No way, no way. Except that given the history of, let's say, what we think of as knowledge transfer and like our perspective about who has the knowledge that they have to send to who and whose knowledge is, you know, valid or validated, all of that means that when people from, or architects from Europe come to Africa and work, they have to sort of be aware of all these. My challenge is that in a lot of cases, some of these projects are, at least from the 60s, they've been branded as knowledge transfer or like, you know, showing people new skills of how to do things. It doesn't seem to have worked because 60 years later, and Femi, we were having a conversation yesterday where a group of people come to Benin and they are trying to look for projects done by Beninois architects. And it seems as if all the big projects are done by French architects, perhaps sitting in Paris. As somebody who has studied in that context, there's a way that you know, there was a way that affects your psyche because it almost tells you like, am I just as capable, or is it that every time we have like, and like, again, I don't know much about this project, but is it that every time we have an important building, we need to go back to Europe to ask people to come and do it? So that's sort of my reaction to that. Like there's a way that there's the power relationship there, I think can be problematic, and there needs to be a lot of work done around big name architects, you know, or even European architects in general working in Africa, as valuable as that may be, and I don't deny that at all. The second question about earth, and I'll just answer this and let the others speak. The second question about earth, now, there are two things, one which is historical that we still haven't solved, which is that for a very long time, given our colonial history, the natural, let's say the indigenous building methods and processes were very much looked down upon, and they were seen as inferior to let's say, European methods of building and construction. And so for a very long time, building in earth was seen in a lot of contexts as undesirable, and a lot of people still have that mentality that if you're to try and build in earth, they would want a building that looks like what, let's say, a modern building elsewhere. The irony, of course, is that in several parts of Europe, you know, brick buildings are all over the place. Yeah, but there's a lot of social perception that you have to deal with if you want to build in the more traditional ways. Then there's the question of research, because obviously you're not trying to build the way we built 500 years ago. We are trying to build in a way that looks forward into the future. You're trying to accommodate new programs or uses. And so the question is, how do you take those ideas, those techniques, and bring it into the contemporary. And that depends on a lot of research, and research demands resources. In a lot of cases, those resources do not exist. And sometimes some of those, and again, I haven't done the work on this, but just based on experience, I've heard colleagues say, for example, that rammed earth has become like a very common thing. People like rammed earth where, you put the shuttering and then you ram it. People would say, for example, that just because we have not invested in it all these years, the knowledge, the skills, it actually costs a lot more to build it than if you use concrete blocks, right? So it's a disincentive. And again, it goes back to many years of just not investing in it and like supporting the industry to grow. So those are the two things. I think I'll leave there.
So I'm literally going to jump on what Emmanuel said is about the process of, I don't know if it's industrialization, because as he just mentioned, trying to build with earth right now costs a lot of money because the chain of work from the supply chain to the manufacturer to the labor to the quality of execution is not there yet. And actually, it costs so much more to build right now. And the main problem we face is that even when we go, for example, I really try to build in that way at least to 70%. Also, of course, I'll always use concrete because of his quality. But at the same time, there's a question of how to convince your client to shift away and to think about building in earth, because even then, it's not accepted yet. And the scale of the people that built it in Cotonou, I only know one manufacturer that builds in earth right now and fabric bricks. So how do you come from one scale like that to building a city, etc.? And I'm going to take that opportunity to build back on something I said earlier. I spoke about the 20,000 project, and one of my problems was that they did not try to build in that material. But there was one obvious question that Kofi Diabate had to ask. How do you build for 10,000 housing in less than 3 years in brick? That's one of the problems we could have tackled, but it's very tricky. So I understand why you cannot build maybe 20,000 housing just on the dot, but maybe we could have tried to build maybe 100 or 200 just to test. So even when you have large-scale projects, you need to take the opportunity to try things to incentivize for that domain of the material to develop. But even when you have big projects and you don't even give the opportunity to that, then it doesn't happen. So this is literally a practical example of things that could have been done or should have been done. But I also understand the different intricacies of choosing that way. So that's just one example of the things.
Julia, I was thinking especially on this thing of your work on research on views of Africa, this idea of African architecture seems much freer.
I have nothing to say about brick methods, but I would say something. I don't know the specific building that you're referring to by an Italian architect, but obviously there is a lot of European architecture from the post-colonial period, 60s, 70s, 80s, and as well as a lot of colonial architecture which remains central to many states. So in Ghana, until very recently, the presidential palace was in a slave fort, a European slave fort. In South Africa, the presidential palace is in a colonial building which was designed to celebrate the union between two white races, had nothing to do with the local population. And there are many buildings. I mean, in fact, if you look at Abidjan in Côte d'Ivoire, this is full of the most dramatic and exciting modernist architecture, which was built after independence, but it was built by European architects. And it's a sort of bittersweet thing. There's a lot of pride in Abidjan. People are very proud of their architecture, rightly so. It's extremely impressive. And in fact, Issa Diabate does regular tours, and there's a great efforts made to conserve this architecture. Eritrea in Asmara, as you know, the jewel of modernist architecture in East Africa. Local people are campaign to preserve these buildings. In the cases where buildings have been reappropriated, so they were colonial buildings, explicitly colonial buildings of oppression, like the slave forts like the colonial headquarters. Well, so it's complicated, and one of the things that people have said to me in interviews is some people can't bear them, some people hate them, let's get rid of them. Many people, particularly younger people, say, actually what these buildings say now is we got rid of that, we've taken that building over, it belongs to us now. And in fact, in Ghana, for example, the fort, which was the presidential palace, you know, that building has a long post-colonial history now. It's not just about colonialism and slavery, it's about all the things that have happened since independence. So buildings, it's quite interesting, an architect said to me sadly recently, but what about objectivity in buildings? And I said, there's no objectivity. This is about the people who live with buildings and what they decide to make of them. And so these buildings get given new stories and they have new narratives. This is not to detract from the points that my colleagues are making about the importance of seeing Africans building and thinking about what the landscape should look like. But it's still to say that it's more complex to think about the European contributions. They are African now, many of them.
So just in the final 10 minutes, less than, so maybe 2 minutes each, kind of wrap-in questions. So I'm just going to say the questions, and you remember them and you answer. So Fiona, I want you to speak to what sort of lessons going forward from this essay are you taking on in doing your work for the future? For Femi, I want to ask what you see, because you've done construction projects in different contexts. So what lessons from your work, your ideas do you see going across the continent and beyond? And Emmanuel, as an architect who's also an academic, what can people working on the ground, like Fiona and Femi, say that academics cannot? And for Julia, what do you hope to achieve with this book? What do you most want readers to get out of this? And we'll start with Emmanuel once again.
So in the African context at least, and for me specifically in a Ghanaian context, I think the line between, especially when it comes to people who teach, people who you would think of as academics, especially in architecture, there's a very faint line because a lot of academics also practice. But having said that, there's a lot that people like Fiona or Femi, because they are at the forefront of building these massive projects, a lot of times they're in a better position working very directly with governments or state institutions. They have a better sense of what it might take to change the system, if you like. So academics, at least in that context, can be a bit removed. I mean, it's very easy to train younger students, and I think you even alluded to this, to work in a certain ideal that doesn't really exist in reality. And so there's definitely lessons to be learned from the people who have left the academic institutions and they are in the field and they can tell us what they think will work on the ground, what it will take to change it. And back in Ghana, I think what we started to do a lot of was to work with we looked at the city of Tema. For those of us who know, it's designed in the 1960s by Doxiadis. And we were working a lot with the municipal or the local government to think about what is your vision for this place? How can we as a school plug into that? And so that conversation that between them we have to continue that conversation between practitioners and academics, yeah.
Okay. For me, I would say that we need to shift the conversation from, we need public participation, to look at how effective is the one that is happening to the people that are participating in this. Because we're creating a situation where people don't trust the process, and it just ends up being a mess, where it's supposed to be helping them. And one of the ways that I argue in the essay is embracing technology in this process, using the internet to reach more people, especially the young people. Because for the physical meetings, you'll find very, very old, let's say seasoned people in there, the community leaders and all that. But where are the young people? They're out hustling, yes, but we need them here to make decisions that affect them. These are infrastructure projects that they are going to use, that their children are going to use. So going forward, I think we really need to embrace technology in these processes to make it more efficient and look for other ways that we can actually make it better and better and better.
To me, the question of the local context is very important because, as Philip asked and Julia said, we are given like this set of buildings that are there right now. We cannot escape from them. But we have to look at our local context, past and present, to be able to direct our future. That means what? That means researching our local context, its impact, its dynamics, to be able to like take the right information to infuse it the building. And it's something that I'm trying to do because I feel like, but if we don't look at the local context, then we just like replicate whatever things that has not been working for ourselves so far. And that's been one thing that's been recurrent, is that people just build not thinking completely about the local ways of living, the local ways of navigating, the local ways of transportation. But once you look at the local context, there's a set of data, like, for example, informality that many of us talk in the book, sorry. Informality is a set of data. I don't like to use the word informality, but it has a set of data, technology, it uses the sun, it uses the shade, and people are there and they sell something. Once we integrate those data and those local characteristics, then we can design better. That's what I want to say.
Very quickly, I think the one thing that my big bugbear is the idea of this idea of building new African cities, of saying, let's just start again. There's such a fashion now for these high-tech, glamorous places that leave the mess behind, and almost like they leave the politics, maybe leave the people, because actually you're talking about havens for middle classes and for tourists and for high-tech, and one of the things that I think this book does is it says, it looks at how actual people living in actual cities, dealing with actual politics, need to be engaged and need to be involved in making their cities work better. And it's not a dramatic step and a grand project. In fact, I want to borrow Femi's term, which is it's needlework. It's little bits of stitching here and there, little interventions that try and make things work within the context where they already are.
Thank you, especially everyone was so great with sticking to time. So just as closing statements, copies of our new book are available at the Biennale bookshop for €15. If we sell thousands, we can afford some coffees. But it's also available online for free. You can download an ebook. Just go to africanstatearchitecture.co.uk. Click on publications and it's somehow there, or just catch me when I come off the stage and I will give you the link. Thank you for coming and thank you for your questions.